All right, so let me introduce our presenter. So she leads the cluster on adequate standard of living under the Economic, Social, Cultural Rights section of the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. So her cluster's portfolio covers rights to housing, land, and property, in addition to the right to food, the right to water, and sanitation, as well as local government support. So she has been working with the Office of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights since 2014, and has worked on issues like human rights and the environment and climate change. She has also supported field operations, as well as universal periodic review. Previously, she worked with civil society organizations in her home country and in other countries. She holds a degree in International Development Studies from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences, and a bachelor's degree in International Development and Cooperation from the University of Bologna in Italy. So friends, allow me to join me in welcoming and extending a warm hand to our colleague all the way from Geneva, Switzerland, from UN Human Rights Headquarters, who will be presenting on customary land and human rights. So ladies and gentlemen, may I please call on stage Ms. Therese Arnesen.
Thank you, Mark. It's an absolute honor to be here today in Papua New Guinea. Deputy Prime Minister, members of Parliament, Chairman of the Committee, UN Resident Coordinator and the UN Country Team, landowners, community leaders, civil society were gathered here today, and I have a very short presentation for all of you. To zoom a little bit out, I hope you can see it well, but we'll run quickly through what does human rights frameworks say about land? What does it say about customary land rights, about traditional land rights? What is the legal framework that we can lean on? What are the standards that can guide us in improving the system that is governing your land and increase security of tenure? I want to start out hearing from some of you. Raise your hand if you'd like to get the mic for a second and tell me, what is land to you? Don't be shy. Just a very brief introduction and an explanation about what land means to you and your community. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Holmes Kissing. I'm here on behalf of the Budibam Council of Chiefs and the Ahi people. Land for some people is a commodity that's commercialized or monetized for their convenience. To us, the land is our life. The land is who we are connected to. The land connects us to our ancestors and it connects us to our future. The land is the only transgenerational asset that can be transferred from one generation to another. The land is what binds us in our children's future for the hope of a better tomorrow. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Have another lady here, please.
Dabanamona, everybody. Let's first of all give respect to the landowners of which we stand upon, the Motu and the Koitabu people who own the land of which the city of Port Moresby sits upon. Let us also acknowledge the Motu language of which belongs to the people of the land. For us, land is not customary. Land is native. I'm born from it. I eat my ancestor because I bury him and then I have him as my food. I take him into my soul. That is what land means. A white man, excuse my term, a white man brought a description telling us that it's traditional. A white man came and told us that it's customary. No, it is not. I am native to the land. When you bring a fir tree and you put it and plant it, it's from a foreign land and it's planted here. You bring a hibiscus branch and you come and you plant it here, it's still foreign. But there is Boroko. Huh? Boroko is natural and native to the land, not brought from anywhere. It is here, long before you came. And that is the meaning of land to me. I am native, born by birth. Therefore, when somebody tells me that it's customary land, no, it's not customary land. I am native to the land, and you will never replace me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll move to the other side of the room. We'll have one more. Thank you, Mark.
So land is like the wind. You don't put a price to land. Can you give a price tag to the wind that you breathe, the air that you breathe? Can you? No. You cannot put a price tag to the air that you breathe. And land is just like that. It's priceless. I just wanted to also make a correction about the term we use about landowners. It's a foreign term. We are guardians to the land. We are guardians to the land we are born into.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll start with apologies to those that wasn't heard right now. We'll start with my presentation very quickly because we want to run into a panel debate where we'll discuss this more about what this means to apply the international laws and standards to Papua New Guinea. And then afterwards we'll continue talking in the breaks. Next, please. So we're just using, so all the terminology that we are using is globally agreed language and terminology that is in the different conventions and declarations. Obviously the situation in each country is unique, so I'm aware of the different terminology used in Papua New Guinea, so this is just to give you a glimpse of how it is addressed at the international level, and then everything that is done in Papua New Guinea will have to follow the local customs and traditions and the right to self-determination, just to make that very clear. We'll talk very quickly about housing, land, and property rights. Why? Because these rights are so interlinked. Next, please. We have an international framework to which Papua New Guinea is a state party. In particular, the age, the housing in housing, land, and property rights is the right to adequate housing that's enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. Papua New Guinea is a state party to that covenant, and that brings very specific legal obligations on the state, on the authorities, to realize this right. We'll talk a little bit more about that right and what that means to land shortly. When we talk about land rights as a general term, under international human rights law, initially, land has always been seen as an enabler for other rights, in connection to other human rights, as we were talking about. Health, education, livelihoods, all these things that we've been mentioning already throughout this morning, and the challenges that people face on the ground. We have 2 declarations that's been adopted by the UN, voted by member states, that really goes a long way in pushing this law forward. International human rights law is organic, it's developing based on the things that we do, the demands that you push forward. And so the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is exactly that. It's a very important instrument. It's a tool for you to use to claim your rights, and a tool and a guidance for governments to be able to comply with the obligations that they have under international human rights law. We also have another declaration on the rights of peasants and other people working in rural areas. It's very important because it's quite new. It was adopted only a few years ago. And it also applies to everyone who identifies as an indigenous person or community, but that also live as small-scale food producers, which I think is very much the case in Papua New Guinea. And then just because the property term is used so often, and we will talk more about, owning, accessing, or being a custodian of land, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is really just the first human rights instruments where states together decided upon and elaborated what does it mean, what are human rights about. That's the first place where we heard about property. We can go to the next slide, please. the whole point about using this terminology, why we're talking about housing, land, and property rights, this is all about having somewhere safe to live. Safe meaning that you're not afraid that you will be displaced, that you will be kicked out, that someone is threatening you or harassing you, wanting to encroach upon what you hold. It's intrinsically linked to livelihoods. There's no need for me to tell you any of this, but it's just to understand how human rights law has been conceptuated to gather all of this under one umbrella. We'll just move on to the next slide. Why we're talking about the right to adequate housing, because it's such a key component of the right to an adequate standard of living enshrined under the convention. So again, direct state obligations to make sure that this right is respected and that it is protected and that it is realized for everyone. It has 7 key elements, but what we really want to talk about is security of tenure, and that you cannot have security of tenure to your housing if you don't have this to your land. So that's where we're making this link. We'll move on to the next slide, because we want to talk more about land today. And I don't need to say what land is because you've already said it. And it might mean something different to everyone. But what human rights law is adding is this aspect that land is just not about a resource or an asset that is economic, right? It really tries to highlight the social aspects, the political aspects, the spiritual aspects of land that are so important and that cannot be substituted, cannot be replaced, and it will not be the same. If you're moved from your land to some other land, that's not what land is. And we'll talk about, how international law sees that when we get into the discourse about remedies, restitution, and compensation, why these things are so different. But anyway, what we've agreed upon under the International Human Rights Law framework is that the access and the use and the control over land, the custodianship we should add here, really is very important for all of human rights. And that's why it's such an important aspect of the human rights system that is being strengthened. It's being strengthened with these developments that we've mentioned, with the adoption of these 2 declarations, that for the first time recognized land as a self-standing human rights for the groups that are covered by the declarations. And this is really, really, really key for securing your rights. Next slide, please. Women. We have to talk about women. Women and HLP rights. Women and access to land, security of tenure, control over land, access to and control over the resources that are linked to the land, because the situation is very grim across the world, generally, independent of the society that you live in, independent of what kind of legal system you live in, independent of where you are born. We, women, have very little rights. And when we do have rights, we only have them on paper, or we only have them formally. So for any kind of land tenure security reform or improvement, this really has to be centered also around the rights of women. And we have a committee, fantastic committee, that's monitoring the implementation of the Convention on Women's Rights, that Papua New Guinea also is a state party to, which has issued very clear legal guidance. So these committees, they're based in Geneva. That's why we're talking about Geneva. You don't need Geneva for anything else, but these committees are quite useful because they have a detailed look at what's happening at the country level, and they're looking at what the convention says, and then they're identifying some gaps and some recommendations, usually very good ones. And so, based on these practices, monitoring and reviewing state practices and reports, civil society can feed into this, academia, national human rights institutions can interact with the committees and share information so that they get a better view of what's happening on the ground in each country that's a state party to the different treaties. And so they've issued a lot of guidance specifically on rural women, specifically on indigenous women and girls, because there is so much more that needs to be done to ensure that we have equal rights. Equality and non-discrimination is really the absolute fundamentals of international human rights law. And so if we're talking about equality at the national level in terms of titling, in terms of who's owning what where, that you don't have equality if you don't have gender equality. Let's move on. So as I mentioned, states have very clear obligations related to land and human rights. States need to ensure the respect for this right, the protection of the fulfillment. We won't dive much into what it means right now, but we'll move on to the next slide, where we're talking a little bit more about the fulfillment, because there's a whole series of things that states can and should do, depending on the national situation, to make sure that these rights are fulfilled. And one of these things is to ensure both secure and equitable and sustainable access to land, access to justice in relation to land matters. In certain cases, we advocate for agrarian reform. That's pretty radical, talking about law that's asking for agrarian reform to happen. And then there's a provision here saying that states really need to respect customary collective land tenure systems, protect traditional governance institutions. We'll talk a little bit more about institutions, and ensure meaningful participation in decision making, participation by women, participation by persons with disabilities, participation by youth, who are very often excluded from these processes. We'll move on. Businesses, this is relevant. We're talking about development, we're talking about investments, we're talking about the future of your land and what's being done with it. Member states have agreed on a few things. The primary obligation to realize rights and protect them, but businesses have responsibilities. So already back in 2011, there was a very famous set of guiding principles issued on business and human rights that are very relevant today, increasingly relevant, because they talk about what are the responsibilities for businesses when they cause human rights harm through their operations, when they're indirectly linked with causing human rights harms, and what are their responsibilities to address that. They need policies, they need to do human rights due diligence, they need to do environmental impact assessments, and they really need to have in place processes that can enable redress when things go wrong. Let's move on. Indigenous peoples' rights. We'll go to the next slide, please. It's just a little bit of a recap about what, under the International Human Rights Framework, how land is seen, how land is defined, and what this framework is adding, which is attempting to recap, resonating with many of the things that you've said today. But what's really, really important is this element of identity of culture, how essential it is to survival and well-being. That is intergenerational, so it's quite different from many other rights that we're seeing, and quite different from property as a concept, right? We're talking about something that's living. And then what's really, really fundamental is the right to self-determination. That means to determine what political status and what economic, social, and cultural development you want. This is essential because everyone has the right to development, but it's very, very often malinterpreted on purpose. So this means that development should be led from the bottom and up. That landowners, the people who traditionally occupy the land, who use the land, have the first and foremost rights to decide what's happening there, what's happening with it, what's happening on it, land, waters, rivers. And so again, redress, it's a long and complicated chapter, but it's a key principle that needs to underpin all of this, because as you've mentioned in Papua New Guinea today, we're seeing both future development efforts and past efforts to alienate or to expropriate land with some very adverse consequences. Let's move on. So, just want to make very clear that this declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples is an incredibly important piece of paper. The UN General Assembly adopted this by vote 2007. The vast majority of member states voted in favor. There were a few member states that were absent. Papua New Guinea was one of them. Many Pacific Island states were one of them. But it doesn't stop there. Through the actions that authorities, state, the government chooses to take, to the parliament chooses to take, revising laws, repealing laws that are harmful, that are discriminatory, that aren't, doesn't promote equality and equity, you will, in a certain way, already domesticate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The draft bill that we've heard about, that's aiming to secure tenure rights for customary landowners, traditional landowners, native landowners, is actually, can actually be a very good practice if it's done correctly. There's some very good elements in there. As we mentioned, absolutely key to this is self-determination and non-discrimination. Just remember that every day in your everyday life. You have the right not to be discriminated against. We are all equal under the law. Self-determination and the free determination of what priorities and strategies for development and use of your lands is really, really key to everything that we're discussing here today. They're grounded in various articles of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and this possible interference with customary lands, making sure that this is lawful, necessary, and proportionate, it's actually been challenged. It's been challenged in a good way. One of the human rights mechanisms created by the UN are independent experts. We have an independent expert that's called a Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So everything the person on this mandate does, the woman, the man, they rotate. They look at how the declaration is implemented. They look at what's happening to indigenous peoples, what's happening to lands, and how can we strengthen their rights. And the Special Rapporteur has actually said that land is so important for indigenous peoples that actually there is no compromise here. There is nothing that can legitimize expropriation or alienation of lands. So that's a challenge I'm just putting out there because it's been said by the Special Rapporteur. We'll see a quote from a very good Special Rapporteur later on that talks about the institutions of indigenous peoples and why we need to strengthen indigenous representative institutions and governance institutions, and that's the only sustainable way in which we can correct the wrongs of the past, in which security of land can be achieved. Let's move to the next slide, because I know we're eager to get to the panel debate, and we'll hear even more views. What's very important, we can discuss the terminology, but the UN Declaration uses the word traditional lands. That means the lands that have traditionally been occupied or used or held, and that includes the lands that you currently don't have in your possession anymore. That's why it's so important to use this terminology, not overruling any local or national terminology, but it's a really, really, really important caveat that we can undo the wrongs of the past through this legal guidance that we have, through and looked at other states, trying to use what's been done elsewhere when you actually have very good practices to build on here. We talk a lot about modernization and formalization. Actually, the state has an obligation to recognize traditional tenure rights as they are. It's not happening, but that's actually the basis. That's actually the outset of the UN Declaration. I think that's important for the authorities and to be aware of. So we're going back in time. We're talking about modernization, but in order to develop and develop sustainably, we're just going back in time. We're going back to what we had. What we had was great. What we had was was good. The declaration is simply inspired by what has been constituted practices over thousands of years. So it's all already there. We're not making up anything. The declaration isn't making up anything. Next slide, please. Free, prior, and informed consent. Living on the land, owning the land, sees that the development that was promised, the projects that were promised, are not at all what's happening in practice. So, very important. It's not a tick the box. It applies to any project, legislation, relocation. Don't even get me started about relocation. It's gonna put it. So, we're talking about forced relocation or forced evictions. Remedy, the preferred remedy under the declaration, this is written, is restitution. If impossible, if not agreed upon by the communities, we can talk about compensation, but compensation is something very different. How can you compensate land? How can you compensate? You cannot fully compensate land. That's not what land is. Land is not just an economic asset. Compensation allows for demographic engineering. That's what people do in conflict and war. Look at Gaza. It's a very good example why we should not apply compensation as the preferred option. Okay, next slide, please. What does it mean, free, prior, and informed consent? We really, really, really need everyone to understand this because everyone says that they're doing it. No coercion, no intimidation, no manipulation. You know, this is really linked to access to information. The right to access to information is a fundamental principle of human rights law. It's a fundamental right under environmental laws of any kind of development project that you are seeing, access to information. We've heard over and over again that people don't have access to information at all. Not in an adequate manner, not in a timely manner, not in a language that they can understand. They cannot read it, and so on and so forth. Prior, we already talked about that. If it's not prior, then it doesn't comply with free, prior, and informed consent. And informed, again, access to information. Really, really, really key. We'll go to the consent part, and then we're done with free, prior, and informed consent. Next slide, please. What does consent mean? So we already said, it's something that is not a one-off exercise. There's always an opportunity to change your mind if you're not being given what you're promised. The gender perspective is important. It is already in the declaration, but all legal guidance interpreting the declaration has really very, very, very strongly highlighted the gender aspects. Being a woman puts you at exposure of really intersecting multiple forms of discrimination, gender-based violence, and all kinds of intimidation, societal pressure for you to give up the rights that you have, but they're yours. Don't give them up. And then this last point about, as we said already, developing or revising the institutions of indigenous peoples, and to use the decision-making procedures and to use those representative that indigenous peoples have agreed, elected, selected to speak on their behalf. So consultation, let's just go to the next slide. I can't remember what I put there. This is the point about indigenous institutions. Special Rapporteur, former Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, James Anaya. I'll just leave it for you to read, but it's really, he is an indigenous person himself. He's based in what is now Colorado in the US, and hugely contributed to the development and the interpretation of international human rights law related to indigenous peoples. Consultation is my last point. This is the last slide, but consultation. Consultation is not a tick-off. It is really, really, really hard to do it well. We know, we understand that, but it's absolutely fundamental, and if you don't consult widely and properly, you will never end the violence, you will never end the disagreement, and then development won't be sustainable, and then we're stuck in the same process again. I'll stop here, let's go to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reese. Let's give her a round of